The night Corrine heard her mother-in-law's voice drop to a whisper, she knew. She didn't know everything yet. Not the details, not the full scope of it. But something cold moved through her chest like a draft under a door, and she pressed her back against the hallway wall and held her breath. It was a Thursday. Late. She'd come downstairs for a glass of water, because the baby had been fussing, and she'd finally gotten Lily down, and her throat was dry from humming lullabies for 40 minutes straight. The kitchen light was off. The living room light was off. But there was a glow from the den, and there were voices, low, careful voices, and one of them belonged to her husband, Owen's mother, Harriet, and the other belonged to Owen himself. Corrine stood in the dark hallway and listened. She doesn't need to know the timeline, Harriet was saying. What matters is that the transfer happens before the end of the month. Your father's name is still on that account. Mom. Owen's voice was tired in a way that told Corrine he'd heard this before. Not for the first time, not even for the 10th. I told you I'd handle it. You said that in February, now it's June. A pause. The clink of ice in a glass. Her parents are selling the property in September, Harriet continued. That's $240,000, Owen. Maybe more. We can't let that just sit in her name. Corrine didn't move. She wasn't sure she could. It's her inheritance, Owen said. It's family money, and she is barely contributing to this family. She hasn't worked in 2 years. She's raising our daughter. Plenty of women raise children and still bring in income. A pause. Then, more quietly, I love Corrine, you know I do. But she's soft, Owen. She trusts too easily. If you explain it the right way, a joint investment maybe, something for Lily's future, she won't ask questions. Corrine heard her own heartbeat. She heard Owen exhale. She heard him say, let me think about it. And she heard in those 5 words, something she hadn't heard before. Not agreement, but not refusal either. Something in the middle, something that sounded a lot like someone who had already decided and was just looking for permission. She went back upstairs. She didn't get her water. She lay down next to Lily's crib and stared at the ceiling and listened to her daughter breathe, and she thought, how long has this been the plan? Corrine had met Owen at 28. She'd been working as a marketing coordinator for a mid-size architecture firm in Atlanta, the kind of job that paid enough to cover rent and student loans with a little left over for the farmer's market on Saturday mornings. She had her own apartment. She had a savings account she was proud of. She had a life that was hers. Owen was handsome in a quiet way. Not flashy, not loud. He brought her coffee before she asked for it. He remembered things. On their 3rd date, he mentioned a book she'd talked about once, briefly, in passing, and he'd gone and read it. She thought that meant something. She still believed it meant something. That was the problem. They got married 2 years later in a small ceremony in Savannah. Her parents drove up from Tampa. Harriet cried at the reception and held Corrine's face in both hands and said, you are exactly what this family needed. Corrine had felt, in that moment, genuinely loved. She understood now that Harriet was very good at moments. The first year of marriage was fine. More than fine, mostly. They bought a house in Decatur, Owen's name on the mortgage, both their names on the deed, a compromise they'd reached after a long conversation Corrine hadn't thought was significant at the time. Owen's income was more stable, he'd said. It made sense for the loan. She'd agreed because she trusted him, and because the house was beautiful, and because she was 29 and in love, and didn't think to wonder what stable income had to do with whose name went first. Harriet came to visit often. At first, Corrine liked it. Harriet was efficient and capable, and she always brought food, real food, not grocery store rotisserie, and she had opinions about throw pillows and shower grout that Corrine found mildly entertaining. It felt like having a second mother, an upgrade almost from her own mom who was warm but scattered and forgot to water plants and lost her keys twice a week. Then, Lily came, and Harriet didn't leave. She had a guest room by then. It started as just the first few weeks, then extended through Lily's colic, then through Corrine's recovery from a minor postpartum infection, then through what Harriet called the adjustment period, a phrase Corrine came to understand meant, until I decide you're doing this right. Corrine quit her job when Lily was 4 months old. It wasn't entirely her choice, and it wasn't entirely not her choice. Owen had suggested it. Harriet had reinforced it. The firm had been difficult about the schedule. Lily had screamed for 3 hours straight every night for 6 weeks. And Corrine had been running on 90-minute intervals of sleep, and she'd said yes because yes was the only answer she had the energy to give. That was 2 years ago. Now she was 32, home full-time, no paycheck, no professional network she hadn't let atrophy, and a savings account that had quietly drained into the joint account Owen managed because it was simpler, and she shouldn't have to worry about it. She had worried about it, once. She'd brought it up over dinner, 7 or 8 months ago. Owen had looked at her in that particular way he had. Not angry, not dismissive, just slightly tired, and said, "Corrine, I'm not going to steal from you." And she'd felt ashamed for thinking it, and she'd dropped it. She didn't drop it anymore. She didn't confront Owen the next morning. She'd learned enough, in 3 years of marriage, to know that confronting Owen before she had the full picture only put her at a disadvantage. He was good at reframing. He could take a fact and hold it at an angle until it looked like something else entirely, and she would walk away from the conversation somehow apologizing for raising it. So she said nothing. She made breakfast. She smiled when Harriet came downstairs and complimented the eggs. She let Lily wave a spoon at her grandmother's face and laughed along with everyone else. But she started paying attention. She found the notebook in Owen's desk drawer 3 days later. She'd been looking for a stamp, which was true, and she'd found it under a legal pad. It was a small green notebook, the kind sold in drugstore checkout lines. Inside were numbers, and Cecile, her parents' names, with a figure next to them, 240K. Below that, column headings, transfer, joint, LLC, timeline. Corrine photographed every page with her phone. She put the notebook back exactly where she'd found it. That night, while Owen watched television and Harriet had gone to bed early, Corrine sat in the bathroom with the door locked and the fan on, and called her college roommate, Deja, who had gone on to become a paralegal and who had also, for the record, never trusted Owen. "I need to know about marital asset law in Georgia," Corrine said quietly. Deja was quiet for a moment. "Tell me everything." Corrine told her, all of it. The conversation in the den, the notebook, the joint account, the slow removal of her financial independence over 2 years that she had told herself was practical and was now understanding was deliberate. When she finished, her voice was steadier than she expected it to be. "Okay," Deja said. "First thing tomorrow, you call a family law attorney. Not to file anything yet, just to understand what you're entitled to. Second, do not touch the joint account. Do not move money. Do not give them any reason to say you acted first. Third, call your parents tonight. Tell them everything. I can't tell them tonight. My mom will panic. Your mom will panic either way. Better she panics now, while you still have options." Corrine closed her eyes. "What are my options?" "More than you think," Deja said. "You've been out of work for 2 years, but you were employed before the marriage. You gave up your career to raise Lily. Georgia courts factor that. And if he's planning to manipulate you into signing over your inheritance, that's coercive, Corrine. That's not nothing." After she hung up, Corrine sat on the edge of the bathtub for a long time. Through the door, she could hear the low murmur of the television. She thought about the woman she'd been at 28. Her apartment, her savings account, her Saturday mornings. She thought about how she'd handed those things over one by one, slowly, in pieces small enough that she hadn't noticed the weight of them leaving. She was done handing things over. She called her parents the next morning, while Harriet was in the backyard with Lily and Owen was at work. Her father, Howard, picked up on the second ring. He was a quiet man, a retired civil engineer who communicated primarily through song silences and carefully chosen sentences. When Corrine finished talking, he was quiet for what felt like a full minute. Then he said, "I always wondered why he wanted both names taken off the original savings account." Corrine hadn't known that detail. Owen had told her the account was consolidated. She hadn't asked what that meant. "Daddy," she said, "please don't do anything yet." "I'm not going to do anything," he said. "But I want you to know, the property sale is not happening until you tell me it's safe to proceed. Your mother and I don't need that money right now. It can wait." She exhaled. "And, Corrine," his voice was careful, "do you need to come home?" She looked out the kitchen window at Harriet laughing with Lily in the yard. Lily was chasing a butterfly. Harriet was clapping her hands. It looked like a picture from a parenting magazine. "Not yet," Corrine said, "but I might." She found the attorney through Deja, a woman named Helen who practiced out of a small office in Midtown and who had the particular energy of someone who had heard every version of this story before and was neither shocked nor bored by it. Helen walked her through Georgia's equitable distribution laws. She explained what Corrine was likely entitled to given 2 years of unpaid domestic labor and the career she'd left. She explained what transmutation meant in terms of jointly held assets and what Corrine would need to document. She explained what would happen if someone attempted to fraudulently redirect an inheritance and how courts tended to view that. "Do you want to file?" Helen asked at the end. "Not yet," Corrine said. "I want to understand the full picture first." "Good instinct," Helen said. "Come back when you're ready." Corrine drove home with a legal pad full of notes and a clarity she hadn't felt in 2 years. It wasn't anger exactly. Or it was anger, but the kind that sharpens instead of scatters. That evening, Owen brought up the investment. They were washing dishes, A rare moment of domestic normalcy, Harriet already in her room. And Owen set down the pot he was drying and said, "I've been thinking. With the market the way it is, it might make sense to set up a joint investment vehicle. Something we could use to consolidate assets before your parents' sale goes through. Better tax positioning." Corrine kept washing the bowl in her hands. "What kind of vehicle? An LLC maybe. Simple structure. We'd both have equal stake." She turned off the water. She dried her hands on the dish towel. She looked at her husband. He looked back at her with an expression she recognized as the one he used when he had already decided something and was presenting it as a conversation. "Let me think about it," she said. She watched something ease in his posture, the slight release of a man who believed he was getting what he wanted, and she turned back to the sink and turned the water back on. She'd learned something about those words, those 5 words. "Let me think about it." She'd heard them from him before. She understood now what they meant when said by someone who had already decided. She was glad she understood that. The following 2 weeks, Corrine was methodical in a way she'd never allowed herself to be before. She had always thought of herself as an intuitive person, a feeling person, someone who acted from the heart. She understood now that this was something that had been used against her, slowly, over years, by people who planned. She opened her own bank account at a credit union across town. She deposited the cash she'd been given for birthday and Christmas, and the occasional take yourself somewhere nice from her mother. Small amounts, accumulated over 2 years, tucked in an envelope in a shoebox. She'd told herself she was saving for Liz's first big vacation. A few $100s. Not enough to live on, but enough to matter. She called her former manager at the architecture firm. Not to ask for her job back, not yet, but to have a conversation, to reconnect, to plant a seed. The woman remembered her warmly. "I always said we lost you too fast," she told Corrine. "If you ever wanted to come back part-time, we could figure something out." She documented every conversation she remembered with dates as close as she could recall, the notebook she'd photographed, the joint account transfers she'd printed from Owen's desk. She'd found the access code in a note on his phone, a note he'd saved there casually, because he'd stopped thinking of Corrine as someone who looked. She called Deja every 2 or 3 days. She ate dinner with Harriet and Owen and laughed at the right moments and answered questions about the property sale with breezy vagueness. "I think my dad's timeline might have shifted a little. You know how he is," and watched Harriet's eyes flicker with something she'd learned to read now. Calculation dressed up as concern. She loved Lily with the intensity of someone who understood what was at stake. It was Harriet who broke the fragile equilibrium first. On a Sunday morning, 3 weeks after Corrine had stood in the dark hallway and listened to her future being decided without her, Harriet sat down at the kitchen table while Corrine was feeding Lily yogurt and said, in her warmest, most reasonable voice, "I think we should all have a conversation about the property situation, before it gets complicated." Corrine fed Lily another spoonful. "What property situation?" "Your parents' land sale. Owen mentioned it might be moving forward sooner than expected." Owen hadn't mentioned that to Corrine. She filed it away. "I don't think there's a situation," Corrine said. "It's their property. They'll handle it the way they always handle things." "Of course." Harriet smiled. "I only meant that it might be an opportunity. For the family. For Lily's future." Lily flung her spoon across the kitchen. It hit the refrigerator with a satisfying clang. "Harriet," Corrine said very calmly, "I appreciate you thinking about Lily. I think about her all the time." She picked up the spoon. She rinsed it. She handed it back to her daughter. "But anything involving my parents' finances is something I'll discuss with my parents, and with Owen privately, not at the breakfast table." Harriet blinked. It was a small blink, quick, a recalibration. "Of course," she said again in a different tone. That afternoon, Corrine called Helen. "I'm ready," she said. She told Owen on a Tuesday evening. Lily was at her parents'. Corrine had driven her to Tampa the weekend before, had sat with her mother on the back porch and finally, after 2 years, told her everything. Her mother had cried. Then she'd gotten angry. Then she'd made a pot of sweet tea, and they'd sat for 3 hours and figured out a plan together. And Corrine had left Tampa feeling, for the first time in years, like a woman with a net underneath her. Harriet was at her own home that Tuesday. Corrine had asked Owen, carefully, the week before, whether his mother might want some time in her own space. Owen had said he'd mention it. He had, apparently, because Harriet had gone home on Sunday without making much of it. So it was just the two of them, in the living room, after dinner. Owen was looking at his phone. Corrine sat across from him. "I found your notebook," she said. Owen looked up, the green one, in the desk drawer. "I photographed every page." She kept her voice even. "I've spoken to an attorney. I've documented the joint account transfers. I've spoken to my parents, and their property sale will not be moving forward in any direction that involves you or your mother." She paused. "And I've filed a petition for divorce." Owen was very still. She watched his face move through several expressions. Surprise, then something harder, then a careful smoothing out that she recognized as him buying time to think. "Corrine," he said, in the voice he used when he wanted her to feel she was overreacting. "I'm not overreacting," she said. "I've thought about this for 3 weeks. I've had more time to think clearly about this than you think, because you stopped paying attention to what I was doing. That was a mistake." He set down his phone. "This is because of one conversation you overheard." "This is because of 3 years," she said. "The conversation was just when I started listening." He tried 4 more times to redirect her. He was patient about it, methodical. She had once admired that about him. Now she recognized it for what it was, and she didn't move. Each time tried a different angle: the hardship of the process, Lily's stability, the money they'd lose in legal fees, the misunderstanding she might have. She answered with facts, documented facts. Things he couldn't reframe because they were already in writing, already seen by someone with a law degree, already known by her parents and her friend, Deja, and her former manager, who was expecting her call on Friday. Eventually, Owen stopped trying. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. When he looked at her again, something had changed in his expression. The strategy had left it. What remained looked, briefly, like the man she'd married. "I didn't want it to go this way," he said. "I know," she said. And she believed it, a little. She believed he'd wanted a cleaner version of this. A version where she agreed quietly, signed what she was told to sign, and no one had to acknowledge what was actually happening. "What do you want?" he asked. She told him. Equitable division of marital assets. Primary custody of Lily with generous visitation for Owen. Her name off the joint accounts and her original savings restored. A formal acknowledgement that the property belonging to her parents was not and would never be a marital asset. He was quiet for a long time. "Okay," he said finally. The divorce took 7 months. It was not easy, and it was not clean. There were 2 weeks in October when Harriet called Corrine's phone 6 times a day and said things that made Corrine's hands shake, and there was a mediation session in November that left both parties silent and exhausted, and nothing resolved, and there was a moment in December when Owen's attorney tried to argue that Corrine's domestic labor didn't constitute career sacrifice because she hadn't been formally laid off. Helen handled it. Helen was extremely good at her job. Corrine moved into a 2-bedroom apartment in January with Lily and a second-hand couch and a kitchen table from her parents' garage that her father had loaded into his truck and driven up from Tampa himself. He'd stayed for a weekend. He'd fixed 3 things she hadn't asked him to fix, assembled Lily's toddler bed, and made her the same dinner he'd made every Friday of her childhood: pork chops and rice and green beans from a can. And she'd sat across from him at that kitchen table from the garage and felt, for the first time in a long time, like herself. "I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner," she told him on his last evening. Howard shook his head. "You were in it. You can't always see the thing you're standing inside of." She went back to work in February, part-time at first. The architecture firm, as promised, found her a role that fit around Lily's daycare schedule. By April, she'd taken on a full account. By June, her name was on the firm's new project team, and her manager had mentioned, casually, the word senior in connection with a timeline that began next year. Lily turned 3 in March and said approximately 47 words a day, and was developing strong opinions about the color of her cups. And Corrine watched her in the morning light of their apartment, and thought about the version of herself, who had stood in a dark hallway, and heard her future being planned around her. And she felt, now, something she hadn't expected to feel. Not rage, not grief, but a strange and solid gratitude, not for what had happened, but for the moment she had stopped being the woman it was happening to. She didn't owe anyone a different ending. She had written her own.